Science Speaker Series. We are really excited to have Dr. Emily Fairfax with us today. And Emily Fairfax is faculty at University of Minnesota. I think many of you probably know her or know of her and her work, especially around beavers and fire. And I think I will just turn it over to her to get going.
Awesome. Thank you. So I have talked about beavers as architects of climate resilience many, many times. And I thought what would be interesting today is to give a brief overview of sort of the themes that I've been focusing on, and then narrow in on a few of the different kinds of questions that have been bubbling up that we don't necessarily have complete answers for yet, but it's things that we're thinking about as beavers working for us in the struggle with climate change. So I'll take just a little step back. This is an absolutely preaching to the choir moment. Beavers are ecosystem engineers. I'm pretty sure everybody on this call is well aware of that. We know that they are really good at taking simplified and degraded streams like the one that's drawn on this slide, building dams, expanding those dams, digging canals, and ultimately transforming a whole variety of different kinds of waterways into really thriving and lush wetland ecosystems. This ability for them to do that has been recognized over and over again and is featured in things like the Beaver Restoration Guidebook, which is basically your step-by-step guide of how do you work with beavers to restore habitats. So we have been observing this for a while. We've been seeing the many different ways that beavers are changing the landscape and what those changes do for us. And I like to point out, though, that it's easy to forget just how large of an influence that beavers actually have. So this video that you're watching now, this is a drone, and those were two of my field assistants on top of a beaver's lodge. And as the drone goes up and up and up, you are starting to see the extent of engineering that this beaver family has had. So the second dam just came into view on this video. We're starting back up, and the drone rises and rises and rises. Those are humans on top of the beaver lodge. The beavers are even smaller than that, and we're going to see just two of the dams in this complex. And the beavers in this complex have actually built about 14 different dams. Varies year to year. It's usually between 12 and 15, with some of them being abandoned, some of them being rebuilt and remade. But the scale of their influence is absolutely enormous. And keeping that in mind is really important, because the more we think about things like droughts and things like floods and things like fires, the more we need to remember that beavers are operating truly as a geomorphic or geologic force in the landscape. They're not acting like just an individual animal might. When you talk about managing beavers, you're really talking about managing entire ecosystems. And in those places where there's not quite as much connectivity outwards to the floodplain, sometimes folks think, okay, well, my beavers can't build those sprawling wetlands. I'm in a tighter canyon, I'm on a steeper slope. Is their influence smaller here? And to that, I would say no, it just tends to be a little bit longer. So instead of being able to spread out onto the floodplains, what you're seeing in this drone video is a sequence of beaver dams on a pretty steep stream in Wyoming, where it's just dam after dam after dam after dam after dam. And in doing all of this work, what the beavers have done is they've still created that wetland patch, and they're still trying to work about the same amount of area. Instead of being wide and boxy, now it's long and stringy. So the actual shape of the different beaver wetlands can vary quite a bit, but overall, it does not really matter what kind of stream you're on. It could be the deserts, it could be the forests, it could be meadows, prairies, mountains, coasts. Beavers will engineer it, and a lot of those engineering behaviors are really consistent. Dam building, tree cutting, and canal digging. Now, because they have this really broad influence on the landscape, they also have a really strong influence on how water is moving through that landscape. Now, I've shown this figure many times before, but I'll walk us through it again because it's pretty important for most of what I'm going to spend the bulk of this talk focusing on. So we've got those streams without beavers, and we compare them to streams with beavers. One of the biggest influences in the ways that they control hydrology is through connection to groundwater. So in that top panel, or that top row of this figure, we have a stream without beavers, a stream with beavers. I've set the water table pretty deep on both of these. This is common in many parts of North America. It's also common in drought periods or drier seasons. Our degraded streams have a pretty narrow impact on the water table, whereas our stream with beavers has a much larger pond. It has these really spindly canals going out everywhere like little micro streams, and they're basically pinning groundwater up at the surface. Whereas in our stream without beavers, the groundwater around the stream, it's a very narrow area of influence. Now, as long as we have infiltrating precipitation or rainfall or snowmelt or some source of water coming from above, it doesn't really matter how much soil water has been stored if you're the plant. As long as your roots can access some water, they're happy. And if that's rain, that's fine. And if that's soil water, that's also fine. When we enter a period of drought, that's when the beavers really start to shine. So, because they are so good at slowing water down, keeping it on the land longer, giving it time to sink into the soil, they create this huge earthen sponge that's just absolutely full of water. Whereas in our stream without beavers, they don't have that sponge filled up. They're not particularly good at slowing down the water. And so all those plants that can't reach the deep groundwater are going to start to wilt and wither and shut down. Now, once things are dried up, that's when the fires become a problem. So in our stream without beavers, if you have a lightning strike or a campfire or some sort of an ignition event, all of that biomass that grew up in your riparian corridor that was healthy during the rainy period turned into fuel during the dry period, really dry fuel, and that burns really easily. And we've seen plenty of river corridors burn at this point. This is an unfortunate but very real phenomenon in many parts of the country today. In our stream without beavers, we don't see that. Because it never gets drought stressed, because it's really good at slowing down water during flood periods, beaver wetlands are then also really resistant to fire. And in my research, I found this is a very strong and consistent effect. Overall, beaver dammed areas are about 3 times more fire resistant than river corridors without beavers. And if you look at megafires, and this study, these numbers are from the Rocky Mountains, the river corridors that had beaver dams, 89% of that area is fire refugia, meaning it's unburnt or low burn severity. If you are in the river and there's no beaver dams, 60% is fire refugia. And if you're outside your river corridor, about 37% is fire refugia. So the beavers are significantly increasing the fire resistance of the landscape. And I have been studying this for a while. I've been talking about this for a while, but this is not the end of the story. Even as we see more and more examples of this really profound landscape protection that the beavers are able to create, we're not quite at a place where we can say we understand all the details of it. We can mimic this. We can do it ourselves. We know exactly when and where beavers are going to make this happen. We are not there. Where we are is saying beavers make really good fire refugia, but there's so many more questions. And that's what I want to spend the rest of my chatting time on, is to talk about some of those really interesting questions that are coming up and what we found so far and what we're hoping to do in terms of science and studies to be able to really get those concrete data-based answers for folks. So question 1, when we look at these beaver dammed areas, a lot of times what we're reporting on is just the burn severity. So was it burnt? Was it unburned? Was it high severity, low severity, moderate severity? And depending on how your study is designed, those answers are maybe only telling you a small piece of that story. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of data from the Durkee fire, which burned in Oregon. This is about 295,000 acres. It was a pretty recent fire. I think this was last year's. And it's a very dry landscape, and there are a few pretty good patches of beaver activity within that area. So we went through the Durkee fire perimeter and we mapped out all of the beaver dams. And we found those areas that did not have any beaver activity. These are control streams. We found the streams that had lots of beaver activity. These are the experimental streams, although we didn't actually go introduce those beavers there. They found it themselves. And visually, just looking at it in satellite, you can see the difference between the no beaver stream and the fully beaver engineered stream. You can see how much more green there is. You can see some of this pooled water. That's where the beavers are working, just in case you weren't able to see that and find it yourself. And then when the fire comes, we can go through and we can calculate those burn severity measures. Is it unburned? Is it low? Again, looking at this data visually, I can see like, wow, these beavers made a really good patch of refugia. This is great. And there's not a lot of refugia on the stream without beavers. You can also look at the plant greenness and say, wow, there's this huge green patch on the fully beaver engineered stream, and there's just only a couple of speckles of green after the fire on the stream that didn't have any beavers on it. Now, the most common measure for actually looking at this fire resistance, and this is something I've done as well, I'm not just like throwing shade at other researchers, is to go along the stream profile and to extract those pixel values right along the stream profile and see where is it green and where is it not. And when you do that, you get these kinds of plots where it's distance along creek is on your x-axis, your greenness is on your y-axis. And these plots can do a really good job of showing some creeks are much greener than others. Some have much higher NDVI values indicating more green plants than streams maybe that don't have beavers on them. But what I have realized looking at more and more of these profiles in my own research is that what it's not capturing is the width of these green patches. These kinds of profiles are really nice for showing us, yes, there's this bright green signal right next to the stream, and that's amazing. But I've now broken out this blue line is my beavered stream, the gold line is my non-beavered stream. Both of these lines, stripped down into that sort of one-dimensional view, have really high greenness values at some point along the stream. But looking at these patches with my eyes, I can see it's a much, much larger patch where the beavers are engineering, and that's not represented on this kind of plot. So where we have the high NDVI along our beaver engineered stream, it's actually 50 to 110 meters wide on average, whereas on our non-beaver engineered stream, even though the NDVI is very high, even though we have a greenness signature there, it's only 30 to 70 meters wide on average. So you could say from the NDVI or the greenness plot that yes, both of these areas have fire refugia, and you can show this plot and it is a data-based statement. But without also having that satellite visual, without doing this sort of width inspection, we're missing the fact that there's a much broader influence of fire refugia where the beavers are working. They're not just increasing greenness right along the riverbanks, they're creating really broad green wetland habitats. And so an insight as we've started to work on this and reanalyze some of our data and think about how we're presenting our data differently, we do have really strong fire resistance when the beavers are controlling the landscapes out west. This is super, super clear. But if we're just doing these linear analyses of the river corridor, we are capturing the presence and absence of fire refugia, but we are not really capturing the size of the refugia. And that matters because we're talking about area of habitat preserved. If you have 50 animals and they each need 1 square meter of habitat, then you need 50 square meters of preservation. And you just are not getting that information doing these linear analyses. So going forwards, one thing that my lab is focusing on, and that I encourage other people working on these kinds of resilience questions to focus on, is not just presence absence of refugia or greenness or things like that, but also width. And unfortunately, that's a much more complicated and in-depth GIS process to get there and to extract that information. But it does seem to be quite worth it, especially when you have some fires that'll burn bright, very close to the river's edge where there's no beavers. You get this narrow band of greenness. That is not serving the same ecological function as an entire preserved wetland along the river corridor. So that's one of our beaver and fire questions that's been sort of floating to the surface lately and that we've been thinking about. Another one that comes up all the time, especially now that I live in Minnesota, is this fire resistance really just a Western US thing? It doesn't seem like there's very many studies of it happening in other landscapes. And that's very true. There's not a lot of studies of this happening in other landscapes. There've been just a couple. But this is an area that needs a lot more work. Wildfire has been a very present problem for the American West for the last 20 or 30 years. There have been big fire events. There have been really high profile things happening with wildfire and difficulties fighting fire. And so it makes sense that there's been a lot of attention on firefighting strategies in the American West. But if you remember back to the very beginning of this, beavers are not just building their dams in the American West, and beavers can actually have a much larger influence spatially in some of these flatter landscapes, or maybe are able to build more dams and have larger families in some of these more resource-rich landscapes that have more food and more water for them. So what does fire resistance look like in other places? When I started trying to answer this question, I was encountering a lot more places that had inactive beaver dams outside of the West. So here in Minnesota, for example, there are a number of landscapes where there are beaver dams that are still in place and still holding water, and there's absolutely no beavers at them. They've either moved on or they've been trapped, but the dam is persisting, and we don't usually have really high flows to blow out those dams and totally erase them from the landscape. So they tend to persist a little bit longer. That would be an inactive beaver dam or beaver wetland. We also have a lot of active beaver wetlands where it's clearly at its highest water holding capacity. There is an active beaver lodge. There are many beaver canals. There's tree chewing happening in the moment. And so there's these active situations and these inactive situations. And while they both have beaver infrastructure present, they both have dams, they both have canals, they don't both have the actual beavers on site. So As I've looked outside of the American West, where there are more beavers just in general, and more opportunities to study the different stages of beaver habitat colonization, I thought it would also be interesting to compare active beaver wetlands to inactive beaver wetlands during fire. Like I said, we have beavers here in Minnesota, and what some people don't realize is we also have fire here in Minnesota. We don't usually have really big ones. This data here is from the Greenwood Fire, which is a larger fire that burned 2021, I think. I'm pretty sure it was 2021. And I'm currently working on making some new versions of these figures because we had a couple of big fires already burned this year here up in northern Minnesota, where we also have lots of beavers. Now, an image on the left, that's a satellite image of the landscape. And it's a little bit hard to see, but I have black lines outlining the actual beaver dam crests here. And these are active beaver ponds. We have quite a bit of ponding. The lodges are surrounded by deep water still. And when the fire came through, we had very strong fire resistance. That fire burn severity map on the right, red is high severity, blue is low severity. And you can see there's really not that much burning that happened around our Minnesota active beaver wetlands. We also looked way up north to Alaska. And again, we mapped out the actual beaver dams in each of the river corridors and the places that didn't have beaver dams. Then we looked at the burn severity. And just like in the drier landscapes out west, even when we are up in the boreal and the subboreal, and even the tundra and the permafrost, we are seeing pretty good fire resistance at those beaver wetlands. We're getting a lot of low severity burning and some completely unburnt areas where those beavers have engineered the riverscape. In British Columbia, and I know this is the West, but it's not really the American West as we conceptualize it. BC is a lot more wet than many parts of the American West that I focused on before. It definitely has denser forests than many of those places. So I looked at beaver wetlands there, and in the active beaver wetlands, it's the exact same story. We have really strong fire resistance. We have unburned patches, we have low severity patches. This fire was absolutely devastating. It was almost entirely high severity, except where those beavers were working. So what this is telling me is that, as we go through these other landscapes, we are seeing when beavers are present, the effect is consistent. Beavers on site equals strong fire resistance. It doesn't matter if you're in the tundra, it doesn't matter if you're in peatlands, doesn't matter if you're in the Northwoods, it doesn't matter where you are. We are seeing strong fire resistance at active beaver wetlands. We also, like I mentioned, we're looking at some drained and inactive beaver wetlands. Now, I like to show this photo on this slide for a couple of reasons. We map beaver dams a lot in the lab, and most of that is with satellite, and sometimes it's on ground. And this, to me, was one of the funniest beaver dams I've ever mapped, because when you're on ground, if you have not spent a ton of time in beaver meadows, you would not think this is a beaver dam. It is just a line of willows that goes across the meadow here, and this is in Wyoming in the Happy Jack area. But if you look at it from satellite and aerial, that line of willows is exactly beaver dam shaped. And when we were at the site, all you have to do is pull back one layer of the grass, and you can see that what those willows are growing on is an old buried beaver dam. And the willows are growing there because the dam is built of old willows. And so they've sprouted and made this sort of preserved dam line, and all the rest of the mud that was the beaver pond bottom is filled in with grasses and sedges. So clearly, beavers can have this really extended influence on the landscape. This is a meadow now. This is almost a dry meadow now, and it still has these artifacts of beaver engineering. And I was noticing that sometimes there's enough influence left over that the beavers can still create fire resistance even when they've been gone a long time. But sometimes that's also not the case. So looking across different landscapes again, we found places where there were some very old beaver ponds, but they were routinely filled and also routinely drained. So they seem to be going in this pretty natural cycle of fill, drain, fill, drain, fill, drain. Beavers are on site, they're just moving around for their food needs or because there's predators that are locking in on them. This part of Ontario has wolves. But they're consistently being colonized, abandoned, recolonized. In that scenario, in Ontario, in wetter landscapes, we see incredibly strong fire resistance, even if the beavers are not there in that moment. So in this particular stream that I'm showing you on the screen here, most of these beaver dams were drained off right before the fire happened, and then the fire happened and it burned, and we still had that really strong fire suppression effect where the beavers had been working. They still had done something to the landscape that made sure that it was still either too wet or too difficult to burn for some reason. Looking in Minnesota, we had a place where the beaver dams had not been full for at least 18 years before the fire, and they had been drained pretty consistently for those 18 years. So the fire comes through, and we did not see super strong fire resistance, but we did see some fire resistance. There were these sort of echoes of where the ponds used to be, where we didn't go down to full fire refugia effect. We didn't get the unburned, and we only got a couple spots that were even low severity burning, but we could see these little shadows of moderate. And so, at least in this part of Minnesota, if the beavers had been gone for 18 years, you lost most of your fire resistance. Not all of it, but most of it. Seeing the difference between these two landscapes, it begs the question, how often do beavers have to be there for it to be fire resistant continuously? Clearly up in Ontario, even when the beavers were gone, it was able to resist burning, but just a little bit south in Minnesota, that wasn't the case. So what's different about these two landscapes? That's really got me and my team starting to dig a little bit deeper into the timescales and the mechanisms of beaver-driven fire resistance. How are they making fire resistance? I talk a lot about the water storage and the water storage beneath the soil and how that keeps plants green, which makes them difficult to burn. And that's where it comes from. But that can't be the only thing there, because there's places where it feels like it's not wet anymore at all, and we still get some fire resistance. So something else is happening. What are the different things beyond just pure water storage that lead to beaver wetlands being uniquely difficult to burn? And going through lots and lots of landscapes. I only showed you examples from a few of them here today. All sorts of places across Canada and Alaska and the US, West Coast to East Coast, North to South. We've identified 4 things that we think are leading to fire resistance in beaver wetlands. There is surface water storage in the ponds and the canals. This happens quickly. The beaver builds the dam, water gets stored. It also is lost quickly. The dam is removed, the water drains away. When the pond is there, that is strong fire resistance. It is water. It doesn't burn. It's very wet. And so this is a good thing for us to know. We can get fire resistance really quick by ponding water, but we can also lose that resistance really quick when we lose the beavers. The next thing we found is floodplain soil water storage. So there's surface water, that's the water that's sitting on top of the stream bed. And then we also have the greater floodplain area getting rehydrated by having the beaver dam there. This is going to take a little bit longer to have happen. When water moves through the soil, it moves much slower, and you need to let the beaver dam be there and be in place and be slowing water down and pushing it out onto the floodplain for a while. So it takes some time to build it, but it does create pretty good fire resistance. It's pretty strong. If the soil is really wet, it's not going to burn. We have lots of good drone photos and satellite data showing even where there's not ponded water, we're still getting fire resistance. And we think that a lot of that is coming from the soil water. It will drain off if you lose the beavers. So if you lose those dams, if the beavers are gone, your canals start to fill back in, the pond drains away, slowly your floodplain will also drain its water off. You need to be actively storing water to keep it full of water, and that means you need to have beavers present fairly often to maintain those dams, be that flow obstruction, and get the water out to the floodplain. So it takes a bit longer to build, but it also takes a bit longer to lose. Then we have valley bottom fuel thinning. One of the biggest conflicts with beavers is their fuel thinning skills, where they can pretty quickly cut down a lot of trees. And while this is most often a nuisance in places where people are living, this is actually a pretty powerful thing on public lands where we need the fuels to be thinned. We spend a lot of money and time thinning fuels. Beavers do that too, except they're not spending money, they are spending time. And they can just go out and thin the forest and do it really strategically and take down some big old mature trees and then make some space for some little younger trees and open the canopy up. And open canopies spread fire more slowly because they are not leaf to leaf up there. There's spaces between the tree branches. Now this is going to take a decent amount of time to have happen. Beavers do chew trees quickly, but a beaver is not going to go out and thin an entire forest overnight. It's going to thin what it needs. So the longer it's there, the more thinning effect you have, and the more sort of shift from this overdense forest to an appropriately dense forest you will get within the beaver's foraging distance. And that distance could be anywhere from maybe 30 meters up to hundreds of meters, depending on the topography and physical context of your landscape. Now, thinning fuels is not going to be enough in these systems to completely stop a fire, but it is going to contribute to that fire resistance. It is one more layer of things that beavers are doing that makes it hard for their wetlands to burn. And just like it takes a pretty long time to get to that nice thinned out state, it's also going to take a pretty long time to overcrowd again when you lose the beavers. So there's sort of this balance that we're seeing with each of these mechanisms. The longer it takes to establish because of the beaver's engineering behaviors, also the longer it's going to take to lose when you lose those beavers and their engineering behaviors. Now, the last thing that we've identified that's leading to fire resistance is the creation of what we call small patch vegetation mosaics. So having just these little patches of this is my cattails, and this is my cottonwood, and this is my duckweed or my pondweeds. And you have just these patchy ecological communities with different species, and it's not a giant monoculture. And this one is really important in transitioning from often overcrowded, sometimes conifer encroached systems back into diverse wetland mosaic habitats. And when you have that mosaic, you have more diversity of canopy heights, you have more diversity of fuel loads, you have more diversity of temperatures where you can start to burn. And so it's like adding roughness to the landscape for fire. As it tries to burn through, it's not as easy as when you're going from conifer to conifer to conifer to conifer. Now you're trying to go conifer to aspen to shrub to willow to cattail to aspen and back and forth. And that is a difficult path for the fire to take. It takes a while for beavers to truly transform a landscape into a durable wetland. You need to have time for those plants to establish. You need to have time for them to reseed the landscape around them. You need to have time for some survival of the fittest and some canopy repartitioning and some moisture repartitioning and some nutrient repartitioning between the different plant communities. But when you get that over time, that's when beavers are creating basically permanent meadow ecosystems that can persist long past when the beavers are actually gone. This is sort of the crux of the beaver meadow complex, where they create a durable, almost permanent effect on the landscape by virtue of having been there for a while. And we think this contributes to fire resistance. It's not the strongest contribution by any means, but it is probably the most durable. And what's been really interesting to look through is all of these are happening at every active beaver wetland, right? So if the beavers are there, we have all four. It's not like pick one and the beavers will do it for you. They just do all four by virtue of their engineering. But when they leave, we see these different effects sort of fade out more quickly. And as a data and graph nerd, I've tried to sort of visualize what's happening here with the plot. I'm going to walk you through it. Hopefully it makes at least some sense. It definitely helped me think about this more. So the y-axis is like the percent of maximum fire resistance that's been achieved. And on my x-axis, that's time. So in any landscape, you start off with just some baseline fire resistance. Like it's just this hard to burn this landscape. And a lot of that's coming from topography. Some of it might be coming from the soil type or the existing vegetation characteristics. And then beavers arrive and they kick off these four different layers of fire resistance: the surface water storage in light blue, the floodplain storage in dark blue, the fuel thinning in dark green, and then those vegetation community mosaics in that light green. And this just launches them straight to highly fire resistant. Our highest line is right up there by 100% fire resistance. And then we have these sort of backups that are also contributing to it. As the beavers are there and as they persist, you don't necessarily get like 200% fire resistance by having ponded water stay ponded for a time. Once the pond is there, it's fire resistant, and it stays fire resistant as long as the pond is there. But these ones that take a little bit longer to form, the longer the beavers are there, the more they're able to support fire resistance in the landscape, the more strength that they tend to have. And that matters a lot because when you lose the beavers, remember, we lose all of these effects at about the same rate that we gain them. And so almost immediately, we lose the fire resistance that comes from surface water storage. But then we have that floodplain storage that starts to be our dominant mode of fire resistance. Over some time, the floodplain is draining off, but we still have those those thin fuels. And so we still have this sort of increased fire resistance just by virtue of the beavers having been allowed to cut trees. And then over time, we lose that one, but we still have these vegetation communities that have changed and have become more patchy. And that's still giving us a little bit more fire resistance. And so it doesn't necessarily matter which one is dominant. What we can do is we can sort of map out the overall fire resistance and figure out the speed at which it's going to decay as a function of how long the beavers were there. So this is obviously still a work in progress. That's not the best graph I've ever made, I know. But it is a really interesting line of research for me and something that it's been good to think about, because when beavers are active, we have really consistent fire resistance across the continent. When the beavers are inactive, all these other things start to really matter. How long the beavers were there really matters. The baseline fire resistance of that landscape really matters. The topography matters. The existing vegetation community before the beavers came matters. How often the beavers are there matters. Even if they leave every year, if they also come back every year, that's important to know. And then this decay rate of fire resistance, that's something people need to know too. We can't force beavers to stay at a site 24/7, 365 for eternity. And sometimes they will move on by their own choice, and sometimes they will move on because of our choices. And this kind of information and this kind of study is hopefully going to help us manage our expectations about how much fire resistance will we get when the beavers are not there anymore. Now, another question I get is, can they actually stop the fires? I talk a lot about fire refugia, or patches that beavers make that don't burn. But can a beaver truly stop a wildfire? I want to make sure everybody's clear on the term fire refugia versus fire break. So I've got photos here that look pretty similar, but are actually an example of these two things as separate processes. The top one being a fire refugia strip. So the fire came across, it got to this beaver wetland corridor, it stalled, it blew over, and then it burned the other side. That is fire refugia. We have a patch that's unburned, but it still burned both sides, and the fire was not stopped in its tracks. Fire break, the fire still approaches just the same, but then it gets to the beaver wetland, and when it stalls, it stops. It does not get to the other side, and we preserve the ecosystem on the other side, the fire refugia line. And this ultimately then makes it a fire break. It's important to know which one is going to happen, because that informs our own fire management. A lot of times, if we have beavers out there on the landscape and we are confident they will make fire refugia, that's helpful for ecological planning and for water quality planning. But when our firefighters, or human firefighters, are out there trying to actively manage these systems too, it would be good to know which beaver wetlands we could rely on to actually function as a type of containment. So we've been studying this by mapping out sequences of fire spread. You don't have to really interpret all the little tiny details of this map, but what you're seeing is the spread of the Williams Fork fire from August 15th, 2020 through September 17th, 2020. And each panel, it is spread a little bit further. And as the color gets darker and darker, that's showing sort of the growth of the fire over time. Where the earliest starts are the lightest colors, and then those darker bits are the places that it spread to. Now, in this situation, you are not going to be able to see it when it's super zoomed out like this, but there are these little pink squiggles on the bottom side of that fire arc, and those are manually traced beaver dams. So we can zoom in on them, and now you actually can read this figure, and you can see in that river corridor where we had tons and tons of beaver dams, those little pink squiggles, the full valley bottom was engineered. This is like one of the widest, most stable beaver populations I've found. The fire comes in, and at multiple points, it does push up against the edge of the riparian zone. And it does try to burn in to that valley bottom. And it can't. Over and over and over again, it can't. And it does hop over some steeper topography, and it does have wind assist it getting past a few barriers. But ultimately, this beaver wetland is so wide that it was not able to cross it. The fire was stuck and stopped, and we had a fire break. And one of the cool things about this particular fire, the Williams Fork fire, is we've been looking through the reports of human containment of this fire as well. And on like day one of the fire, before it had even really spread that far, they were counting on this area, this big wetland corridor, to be a fire break. It was listed as contained, even when it had not been at all handled or managed by people yet. It was contained on this edge, which allowed them, looking back, to focus their containment efforts on the eastern side of this fire, where there were not big, healthy wetland corridors, where there were not natural fire breaks. So sometimes we see this fire breaking. We've also seen it up in Alaska. So in this GIF, you can see the fire spreading. And at first we just get refugia on that band of beaver dams that goes to the middle. But then as the fire starts to try to move southwards, it hits a nice strong band of beaver dams and it is stopped. But sometimes we don't get fire refugia. Sometimes we don't get fire breaking, we just get fire refugia. And so you will see the fire move in and it burns on both sides of the beaver wetland and it just keeps moving. And the beaver wetland itself is preserved, but it didn't stop the fire. In this case, that's because the beaver wetland was parallel to the direction of fire spread. And so there wasn't really a good mechanism for that to actually stop the fire. Sometimes, even when the beaver wetland is perpendicular to the direction of fire spread, there are big enough gaps in the river corridor that allow the fire to break through and burn the other side. And we saw this a few times in the Mullen Fire in Wyoming, where we had the beaver wetlands holding the fire back, and then there's this little patch of really unrestored, unhealthy bit, and the fire finds its way through there and gets the other side. And so this speaks to the need to have really continuous and large beaver wetlands. Just having little pockets spread here and there isn't going to be enough to stop the fire. It will be enough to make fire refugia, but not enough to stop it. So our key insight on this question is that when people ask me, can beavers stop fires? The answer is yes, but not always. And there are conditions that make it more likely to happen. If we have a lot of wind, it's less likely to happen. If the fire is smaller, it's more likely to happen. If the fire is burning up in the canopy of pine trees, it's less likely to happen. If the fire is burning in tundra or in shrubland or grassland, it's more likely to happen. The canopy height matters. Some lessons learned though, this takes really recent imagery of beaver dams, and it takes really high density time series of satellite data to be able to actually understand where the beavers were when the fire was happening. We tried doing this at a site up in Alaska, not the one I showed just previously on this slide. And our most recent super high resolution image date was 2017. And knowing how fast beavers are spreading out in Alaska, knowing where they were in 2017 wasn't necessarily helpful information for knowing where they were when a 2024 fire happened. So being able to get that super high res data right before a fire event is really helpful. There's some slightly coarser satellite products that are making it easier to do this if you're a very good beaver mapper. But if you're not a very good beaver mapper, it's really hard to find them in 3x3 meter when you're used to looking in like 0.1 by 0.11 meter imagery. Now, the last question that I get all the time is, what about beaver mimicry and beaver dam analogs? Can we build fire resistance just like the beavers can? If we pretend to be the beavers, not really like I'm doing on this slide, but more like building the structures that they build, can we also build that fire resistance that we are so interested in having? Now, for just a hair of background, it's just how we have lots of manuals about working with beavers. There's also lots of manuals and design guides for pretending to be beavers and for building structures that beavers might build. The LTPBR design manual is one of them. There's lots of different views and schematics for building beaver dam analogs or BDAs, fake beaver dams. And as more and more of these are being built, some of them are being built explicitly for fire resistance. But for a long time, we didn't really have any data on if they are creating fire resistance. We know beavers do, and we know these are supposed to mimic beavers. But if you think about all those layers of things that contribute to fire resistance, it's more than just ponding. And the BDAs are really good at ponding. They're also really good at making floodplain storage over time if they're maintained. But the tree thinning, they don't do that. The vegetation communities, they maybe do that, but a little bit slower. And so we really weren't sure how much fire resistance we can get from these things. A quick caveat, when BDAs are built, they should be leading to beavers. So we have also had a couple of studies that are difficult to interpret because partway through beavers take over. And so then it's hard to say, is this really a BDA study or is this a beaver study? By the time the fire came, beavers were present. So it's a great sign when the beavers show up and take over those BDAs and structures like that, but it also does complicate answering these kinds of questions about just our own engineering. But there are sites where we can answer it. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of data from the Ridge Fire that burned in California last summer. It's a small fire, like 2,700 acres. And it is a place where beavers had not been for a very long time. And BDAs, or beaver dam analogs, were built on one of the tributaries into a creek called Sulphur Creek. Now, the group that built these BDAs, they're like the pros of California BDAs, and the person in charge of it, Kevin Swift, he is basically a beaver, and he can absolutely build like beavers. So I thought this was a really good place to see if a BDA complex, lots of BDAs together, built correctly, which he does, would that create fire resistance? So we had this BDA stream, and then the fire comes, and there's where the BDAs were built. It looks just like the fire refugia we expect from the actual beaver dams, which is encouraging. But I wanted to see if it was functionally different than a nearby tributary that was unrestored. We have the one where we mimicked the beavers, that's the blue and has a little beaver symbol by it. And then we have the one where we have not mimicked beavers and there are no real beavers. And before any restoration, these were very, very similar streams. So I went and I took their greenness signatures over time in both my BDA stream, and remember, this is before the BDAs were built so far, and then in my control stream, BDA stream or future BDA stream in blue, control stream in gold. And we expect to have sort of a rounded seasonal arc in a healthy situation where things green up in the summer, they stay green during the summer, and then they taper off in fall when there's less sunlight. We see what's called a shark wave shape here, where it comes up quickly and then it drops off quickly. And this sort of pointy curve indicates drought stress. It indicates that these plants are running out of water because we know that in July in California, they are not running out of sun and they are not running out of carbon dioxide. So the big limiter there has got to be the water. So we get these shark waves 2 years in a row. And during the dry periods, it does look like the future BDA stream was a little bit greener than the control stream, and we can control for that difference between them when we make one-to-one comparisons later. But then we had a wet year, and the control stream was actually greener than the future BDA stream. And so it seems like they, at least if there's water, they both would perform really similarly. And when they're drought stressed, maybe the BDA stream had a little more innate drought stress to it. I want you to remember this threshold that I just popped up on here, though, 0.3. That's what we want things to be above during the growing season. In the 2 drought years, you can see we drop below it pretty quickly. In the wet year, you can see we stay above it longer. Then the BDAs get built in February 2023. It's a dry year. We return to that shark wave shape in the control stream. But in the BDA stream, it comes up, it peaks, it starts to drop, and then it doesn't. And then it stays elevated. And so what I'm seeing here in this data is that enough water got stored in that early spring to be available to those plants into the summer. And so we're able to resist the drought in 2023. And then 2024 comes and the ridge fire burns and it is nice and green the whole summer long. It is solidly above that 0.3 threshold where we have the BDAs built, and it is not where we did not have any BDAs built. It burns and it stays burnt and it stays well below that threshold. So what this is telling me is that it is possible to get the same kind of fire resistance that beavers build when we mimic them. I have looked at a couple of other BDA sites since then from different builders in different places in different contexts. And sometimes we don't get as strong a fire resistance, and sometimes we do. And I think what this is coming down to is some people are building as if they are true beavers, and some people are still building as if they are people. And maybe we're not building enough structures, or we're not building large enough structures, or we're just not building structures that actually resemble beaver structures. Beavers are chaotic and messy, and our builds need to look the same way. And if we can do that, then we can get fire resistance. Caveat on this is I don't know how long this would persist for. The fire here happened the year after the build. One of the big concerns with BDAs is if they go unmaintained for a long time, they will start to break down, just like an abandoned beaver dam. And so where does our decay curve start then with them? When do we start to lose the resistance that maybe they've built up? I don't have examples of a BDA build that happened 5 years before a fire hit yet. We built lots more of these structures and fires keep happening. So the data set keeps growing. But it's an important question to answer. We are building these for fire resistance. It's possible to get that fire resistance, but it's not guaranteed. Another cool thing that came out of this initial study and that we're looking into more is we actually think, looking at that 2023 data from before the fire happened, that based on the shape of that greenness curve and how it was very different from the years before it, we probably could have predicted that it was going to be fire resistant. It had that greenness curve that we are used to seeing in active beaver wetlands. And so using satellite data, maybe we can actually go into some of our restoration sites and say, okay, this one is functionally restored for wildfire. Maybe it's time to focus our energy on another watershed or another reach at this point. Or we can go in and say, it's not changed the curve yet. We need to add more structures. We need to maintain these structures better. We need to do something different. We're trying to put together a quantitative way to assess how well did we actually be the beaver at a given site. And we're partway there. So regardless of sort of what aspect of wildfire and beavers I'm studying, I keep coming back to the fact that these patches are really, really important. And whether it's a patch or fire break, whether it's big or small, we really need these patches. They are key habitat for so many species. They're really important for removing ash and sediment and debris out of the water column post-fire, which is important for drinking water, it's important for other animals, it's important for the beavers, and it's important for general landscape health. What's the next step? I'm answering all these questions, I'm finding all this data, but what do we actually do next to sort of move the needle forward on beavers and fire? I have to make the joke. Is it time to start airdropping them across North America again? No, it's not. And I'm glad it's not. We really don't need to be dropping beavers out of airplanes. They already are struggling to maintain their two modes of travel on land and in water. We don't need to mix in a third in air. They're the least built for that of all their modes of travel. But I do think we need to keep asking all these questions. And we need to keep asking questions that are sometimes harder questions. We compromise a lot with beavers, and this coexistence has been the biggest boon for beavers in recent years that I can think of. We are getting better and better at living alongside them, protecting our trees from being chewed on, controlling flooding with pipes, moving beavers when they're living somewhere where we don't want to put them somewhere where we do want, but not with airplanes. I think we need to keep making these kinds of compromises because this is what helps bring beavers back. And we desperately need beavers back for their climate resilience help. But I also think we need to study these compromises. All of the things that we do to compromise with beavers and to coexist with beavers have implications for their ecosystem services. When we stop them from chewing, are we stopping them from thinning? When we stop them from flooding, are we stopping them from storing enough water to resist fire? We need to figure out how much we can lower the pond level before we lose that drought resistance or lose that fire resistance. Because otherwise, we're going to wind up in situations where people compromise too hard with the beavers and then don't get the resilience that they expect. And then that sets beavers back a step. So I'm all for coex. We got to keep doing it. We got to keep pushing this forward. But I would really love for us to study it as we do, because maybe it turns out we can do a lot of coex. And beavers are so powerful that us installing fences and pond levelers and translocating beavers really doesn't affect their ability to make climate resilient landscapes. Or maybe it does, but we got to figure out at what point that change happens. And that's going to take science, and it's also going to take a lot of collaboration. This is not a question that you can answer just from the ivory tower or an academic institution. It's also not a question you can just answer from on ground. It really takes people talking to each other, bringing those perspectives together, because beavers are the ultimate interdisciplinary problem. And that's what makes them exciting and also challenging. And so at the last few minutes, I would be happy to answer any questions that folks have about my existing fire research or the directions that we are going with it.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was a really great talk. It's nice to see all those, especially the new quotes of the data that you presented. So for people, you are welcome to put your questions in the chat. I will also monitor the chat, the Q&A, and if you raise your hand, Adam can unmute you and you could say your question. So we have a lot coming in the chat. Do you want me to read them out to you? Would that be the easiest for you? Okay, so Jane Richards asks, are beaver colonies able to survive after big fire goes through them? Especially thinking about water quality and food availability for beavers.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have seen examples of both where they do and they do not. And sometimes when I don't find them after fire, it's not necessarily that I think that they were killed by the fire, but it's that I think they moved on because the site, if it's too full of sediment, especially, that's going to make it very difficult for them to stay there and stay safe. But there's also quite a few sites I've visited where right after the fire, the beavers are still there. The next year, they're still there and they have babies. And the next year, they're there and the babies are there. And the next generation of babies are there. So they're doing fine. The sites where I find them persisting, they tended to have larger patches of refugia around them. in the Rocky Mountain megafires, I found they were preserving about 3 acres per dam of wetland habitat. And if you have 10 dams, then you have 30 acres of preserved food. If your family size can sort of manage that food source for the first couple years, some of their preferred foods like willow and aspen, those do come back very quickly after the fire. So it's sort of this balance slash race between the existing food bank that was preserved, the growth and regrowth rate of the things post-fire, and then also how many other critters are coming to the beaver wetland to make use of those resources. If we have heavy moose pressure or cattle pressure post-fire, that also does make it harder on the beavers. They preserve their food, but now 100 other animals are trying to eat it. They're more likely to pick up and leave.
Chris Jones asks, is there a typical spacing between multiple series of dams, asking specifically around BDAs for these questions that you're asking?
Yeah, great question. The spacing of dams is really, especially with BDAs, is very dependent on the slope. If you try to mimic the way beavers are building, when you're on a high gradient stream, sometimes your BDAs are maybe 10 meters apart from one another. They're packed in there. A lot of them are also sort of laterally staggered. So you'll have the like Y spacing between them might be 5, but this one is over here. So it's a larger total distance between the BDAs. The best way to decide what your spacing should be would be to find an actual beaver complex if you have one nearby, see how many dams per kilometer those actual beavers are building, and then try to mimic that in your own site. So if you're in a place where the beavers are consistently putting in 20 dams per kilometer, you should also be putting in at least 20 dams per kilometer to really be the beaver. If you're out in a really flat landscape, maybe you just need 2 or 3.
The next question is from Laurel Heron. She recently read about the methane accumulation resulting from imbalanced wetlands. What impact might we make on that front as we simultaneously support rehabilitation? Sorry.
Yeah, great question. Methane is tricky. All wetlands are making methane. That is just a part of wetlands, and beaver wetlands are not separate from that. I think what is really important to be studying is the net carbon balance of a lot of these systems, and the ways that beavers alter the net carbon balance is different than in some other wetland systems. So beavers are particularly good at inducing overbank flooding, which stimulates vegetation on the floodplain and can also deposit sediments that are very organic rich onto the floodplain. So they're uniquely good at packing in soil carbon. And if they can do that at a rate that is higher than their methane production, then in terms of carbon balance, they can be a carbon sink, even if they do produce methane. When methane is sort of on a runaway out of control accumulation, I'm not as up to date on all the methane lit as I could be, but I know that things like the age of the beaver pond really matters. The occupancy status of the pond matters. Stagnant water versus flowing water, those are very different types of accumulation systems, and beaver ponds have different units of slower water and faster water. So as much as I don't like saying it depends, this one is very much an it depends on the physical context, all the way down to the single site specific characteristics of that wetland.
Okay. Dear Nicole, they live in British Columbia, and yesterday attended a meeting from British Columbia Wildlife Service where they saw high severity fires burning in the northeast of the province, right up to the wetland and peat bog areas. Some fires are over winter burning around in these bog areas. Has this been a part of your research?
It's a great question. The overwintering fire is also sometimes called zombie fires, if you like to lean into the dramatic earth science terms, are really challenging. It's when the fire, for those of you that don't know, it gets into really organic rich soils like peat, and you can have a snowpack on top of it. You can have all sorts of things on top of it. It looks like the fire's out. And then as soon as snow's off, it starts burning again, and it's back in the spring. So you have like 2 years of fire from one ignition event. These are very hard to deal with. The soil saturation around beaver wetlands is a really good deterrent for zombie fire. They're not great at burning water, even if the water has volatile compounds in it. And so really maintaining that very wet earth sponge is key here. Where some of the peatlands up north have dried or are draining or have really dry patches in them, sometimes from the encroachment of trees and sometimes from human activities. I have seen a lot of beaver wetlands in places where zombie fires happen and have not seen the beaver wetlands involved in zombie fires, but I don't think we've had enough spatial overlap between those two phenomena to say there is no interaction to be had between beaver wetlands and zombie fires. I can't say for sure they stop them, but I also can't say for sure that they don't.
Amy McNamara, Emily, you keep using the term fire resistance. Can you say more about that phrase and when you use it over fire break or fire refugia?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I have started using fire resistance to talk about beaver wetlands as a general thing before a specific fire event happens. We know that they are going to be able to resist burning. And the ultimate sort of knock-on effect of that fire resistance is either going to be refugia or break plus refugia. You don't get a fire break without the refugia as well. Until a fire actually happens, all I can say is this beaver wetland is fire resistant. Once the fire happens, I can then say this was fire refugia or this was a fire break because it had fire resistance. So one is more of like a characteristic of the beaver wetland, and the other is defining a function or a state that it was in post fire. And I think that this helps people not assume it's going to be one or the other. There are places where I feel pretty confident something will be a fire break, but I don't want to call it a fire break until a fire actually happens because the fire hasn't happened. It can't break the fire yet.
Um, from Jim Shepard, uh, this is a hard one, but can this presentation be sent out to all pre-season fire management meetings? We need to get the land management and fire community educated. An excellent presentation.
Thank you, Jim. You'll be happy to hear that I talk nonstop about this with fire management communities. And I've been really well connected with a number of different groups to make sure that I'm getting in front of the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, state forestry agencies to share this data and to answer questions for them. I think I've given probably 30 different talks about this over the last year to help people just think big on firefighting, especially in an era of very limited resources.
So back to Sierra, who's in British Columbia. Thanking you for your answer. There has been multi-year drought happening in the north of the province, so it makes sense that these areas are draining and making the soil veg able to burn. Um, she's very interested in looking more into that, and thanks you for your presentation.
Of course. We are also spinning up a much larger investigation of Canada right now, prompted in part by the air quality I'm experiencing here in Minnesota. So we're like, oh, there's some big fires to the north. Should probably study those. So keep an eye out. I think our lab's tentative goal is to have the Canada study done by December of this year.
Great. I know we're just after 3, but I have a quick question I wanted to get in as well. And
Mhm.
Adam has been putting in information about the next talks. Uh, your conceptual figure of percent resistance with your 4 different lines, have you thought about whether or not the shape of those lines vary and how you might answer that, both on the increasing as well as decreasing sides?
Absolutely. I think that the one line that is not going to vary that much is the just water storage. I don't think it really matters that much on a landscape. If you have surface water, it's not burning. Everything else, I think, is really going to be landscape dependent, and that topography and existing soil type is going to matter a lot, and existing veg before the beaver moves in. If a beaver moves into like an aspen forest, that's going to be a lot faster transition for it to get it to a meadow state because they chew aspen, versus if they move into like I don't know, a desert ecosystem or something that's just a lot harder for them to change, they'll get a lot flatter line and slower growth curve. And then after beaver leaves, I think the loss of effect of water is really driven by the precipitation regime and the climate stressors like drought. And then the vegetation ones, I think they'll be somewhat climate dependent, but I also think they're going to be dependent on other pressures on that vegetation. So if there are grazers, if there are human interests in that landscape, you can lose them or maintain them longer. If someone is there to help preserve this place in the absence of beaver, you can sort of artificially lessen the slope.
So you'd also almost imagine you would have different graphs for different regions and landscapes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I imagine there's going to be like a template for the different regions that then you can like tweak in your specific parameters.
So, do we have any final questions for Emily since we are at just past the hour? Um, give people a chance in case they're typing. All right. I think then at that point, we will ever thank Emily for presenting today. And it was really exciting to have her share her research with us. As Adam said, the next speakers, we're going to actually take a break in July for summer. I think a lot of people are doing field work and really busy and hopefully on vacation for some time as well. And so our next speaker will be on August 14th and will be Kate Larkin on the influence of beavers on riverbed functionality. And I would also remind people to register for the Southeast Beaver Summit if you are interested. And at that, I will close the webinar and say thank you for everybody for attending. And again, thank you, Emily, for presenting today.
Sure thing. Thanks, everybody.